Hi, I'm Dr. James Miller. Welcome to Systematic Theology. For Christians, the Bible is the beginning point for our exploration of the knowledge of God. But the Bible is a collection of various genres of literature: history, parables, poetry, letters, prophecy, proverbs, and apocalyptic literature. Systematic theology intends to take this compilation of various sources and deduce a logical system that clarifies the nature of God, God's revelation to humanity, and the human condition. Systematic theology explores doctrines like creation and fall, justification and sanctification, the Trinity and the Incarnation. We'll look at how theologians have answered questions like, what is God? What does God want for humanity? Who is Jesus? And what can I hope for? It's a discipline that doesn't give us all the answers, but it improves the way we ask questions. If you've ever wanted to take all of your thoughts and ideas about God and try to put them together into a cohesive whole, this class is for you. So welcome to Systematic Theology. Who were the Pharisees? There's a group commonly referenced in the Gospels, the primary opponents of Jesus, the people with whom Jesus argues every day. They're simply named the Pharisees. And if you don't know the backstory, they pop up as a sheerly antagonistic group that seems to only want to argue with Jesus. Jesus' daily calendar is literally work a miracle, fight with a Pharisee, work a miracle, fight with a Pharisee. But who are they? What motivated them? The word Pharisee comes from the Hebrew perushim, which means the set apart ones. Set apart meant distinguished from the culture, pulled out of the culture. It's similar to the word holy, set apart for special purposes and not common. The Pharisees were proud of the fact that they were not Gentiles, they were not Greeks, they were not part of the other cultures surrounding Israel. They were Israel, pure and simple. And so they wanted to be separated from the cultures around them. Perushim. This probably traces its way back to the Babylonian captivity, where the Israelites were taken into slavery in Babylon. And while they were there, as you can gather from the book of Daniel, they tried not to partake of the Babylonian culture. Daniel and his companions asked to eat a separate diet that was free from the fatty foods of the Babylonians. They preserved the Hebrew language and its customs while they were in exile. See, their fear was that if they immersed themselves in the Babylonian culture, that one day maybe their culture would wholly disappear. And they wanted to stay separate. They wanted to keep their identity. They wanted to hold out for the day that God would restore them. Well, sure enough, after 40 or so years in Babylon, Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon and sets all the slaves free. And so in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we watch them go back and repopulate and rebuild the temple that was destroyed and the city of Jerusalem around it. Well, a few hundred years later, this group of set-apart ones have become a more fierce and powerful, recognizable body within the culture of Judaism. There's now a group that is identifiably traced back to about 150 BC, who are particularly a political body named the Pharisees. The Pharisees enjoyed an enormous influence over the Israel of the days of Jesus. Josephus, who some historians believe was a Pharisee himself, speculates that there were probably about 6,000 Pharisees at the time of the fall of the temple in 70 AD. The Pharisees, in order to keep their nation pure, operated under a principle that you should add laws to the law of God in order to protect the law of God. Because if there's a law outside the law, then you won't even get close to violating the law. It actually traces its way back to the Garden of Eden, where the serpent asks Eve, God didn't tell you couldn't eat of the forbidden fruit, did he? And Eve says, he told us not to eat it and not even to touch it. Well, that's not what God said. Eve adds to the command of God, which was don't eat of the fruit of the tree. She says, don't even touch it. And that's sometimes called fencing the tree. And so the Pharisees are always building fences around the law of God so that people never come anywhere close to violating the laws of God. For instance, one law that was very important in first century Judaism, because it so distinguished them from the Roman culture around them, was that they were to honor the Sabbath day and not work on the Sabbath. This might be hard for modern day Americans to wrap their minds around, but it wasn't that long ago that in American culture, particularly in certain areas of the culture, you couldn't have a business open on Saturdays. There were certain areas of the world where you just weren't allowed to, and if you did, you would be the scorn of all your neighbors. It's the Sabbath day. You don't work on the Sabbath day. In fact, even still today, Chick-fil-A, the fast food restaurant, is closed on Sundays, and that's because the owners are Christian and they want to honor the Sabbath day. Well, it was a hot debate in the day because the Romans accused the Jews of being lazy because they took a day off every week. Philo of Alexandria would even defend the Jews against the Romans, saying, if you let us take one day off, we will work so much harder on the other 6 days of the week that you will see that it was worth it to let us have a Sabbath. So this was a hot point of contention where the Pharisees felt like in order to stay pure, in order to stay separate from the culture around us, we have to keep the Sabbath. In fact, this is part of the famous debates between a couple of rabbis in the generation before Jesus, Hillel and Shammai. Shammai was the more strict of the two and really did not want the Jewish population contaminated by Rome. So when asked what is the greatest commandment, Hillel, the more liberal of the two, would say love God and love your neighbor as yourself, or don't do to others what you wouldn't have them do to you. Shammai would say the two greatest commandments are love God and keep the Sabbath day. That's how important it was. So when Jesus is asked what's the greatest commandment, he sides with Hillel. He rejects the keeping of the Sabbath as an essential ingredient of the heart of the law. So that was a hot debate of the day. And so the Pharisees, in order to protect the Sabbath day, added boundaries to the Sabbath day by literally having a certain number of steps beyond which a person could not walk on the Sabbath day, or else it was counted as work. And you can't work on the Sabbath day. So they had a certain number of steps beyond which you could not walk. This brought Jesus into serious debate with the Pharisees on a couple of different points. One, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath day in the temple, and the Pharisees are incensed. And Jesus calls them out for their hypocrisy. He says, if you had an animal that fell in a hole on the Sabbath day, you'd fish it out. Isn't a human being worth so much more? And Jesus defends the healing of a person on the Sabbath day. Secondly, there's a moment at which Jesus' disciples are walking through the fields picking grain on the Sabbath day, and the Pharisees are incensed by that as well. This would lead Jesus to the famous saying, the Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Right? The Sabbath was a gift from God to humanity so that we would have a day of rest and peace and worship in which our worth is not measured by our productivity. And the Pharisees would have none of that because they felt like he was violating something that was at the heart of their set apartness. They particularly resisted Hellenization. They did not like the Greek culture, just as their ancestors did not like the Babylonian culture. I saw an example of that in the modern day. Here in the United States, lots of people migrate to the United States from all over the world. And many parents from another country who are raising children in America try to teach their children to preserve the values and characteristics of the culture from which they came. This is why they have their children enrolled in language classes so that they learn their parents' native tongue. Often they'll try to preserve recipes and holidays that are from their former residence. I remember sitting in a home with a family who was attending my church, and I was sitting in the living room with the dad. They were from another country. The parents had immigrated here, and their daughter was growing up in America. And you could tell they were very concerned that their daughter was adopting American culture as her own instead of staying true to her ancestry. Well, I was sitting there in the living room with him, and one day she came walking down the stairs, and she was a teenager wearing a shirt that was a little bit low and a skirt that was a little bit high. And he suddenly broke into his native tongue and spoke to her in a language that he understood and she understood and I did not. But I could tell from the tone what the conversation was all about. He was concerned that his daughter was becoming Americanized and perhaps too liberal, and he didn't want her going out in public dressed the way he saw her dressed. And that's not an uncommon experience for dads. But this was him trying to preserve his heritage and his identity, his culture, and what mattered to him. And I grew up I married a woman who was the daughter of immigrants, and she grew up in a home where she was required to go to 10 years of Chinese language school in order to preserve her knowledge of Chinese. Well, that's exactly who the Pharisees were. We have to preserve our identity. We have to make sure we speak Hebrew, we practice all the Hebrew holidays, we keep the Hebrew dietary rituals, we keep the Sabbath law. And it's not just religious. This is a way of saying we are not Rome. We are not Assyria. We are not Babylon. God has chosen us, and we need to stay separate from them. In fact, when King Solomon, 1,000 years before Jesus, had intermarried with women from the surrounding cultures, that led him to then go build temples to their gods and worship their gods. And when later on there was a civil war and the kingdom split in half, they would forever look back and say it was Solomon's fault because he was not faithful. He did not stay set apart. He went and committed idolatry by worshiping other gods. And so let's never intermarry with other cultures. This would be in Ezra and Nehemiah. Let's never intermarry with other cultures. Let's stay separate. And the Pharisees inherit that tradition and that instinct. Well, by the day of Jesus, they enjoy wide popular respect because they are seen as the preservers of the culture, the ones who have kept the family together under the oppression of Rome. And so while they're feared, because if the Pharisees don't like you, you're out, they're also widely respected. So this leads them into constant conflict with Jesus, who hangs out with all the wrong people. Jesus hangs out with Samaritans, and they are unclean people with the wrong religious beliefs from the wrong ethnic group. Jesus should be staying separate from them. Jesus defends an adulterous woman. You can't do that. That's polluting the moral law of Israel. Jesus doesn't keep the Sabbath laws. What is wrong with him? His disciples don't fast the way the Pharisees fast twice a week on, I believe it was Mondays and Thursdays, because they believe that was the day Moses went up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments and the day he came back down. Jesus ends up in daily conflict with the Pharisees. In fact, a number of Jesus' parables are told explicitly against the Pharisees. Sometimes he'll end up in direct conflict with them. He'll tell them they are sons of the devil and that they are corrupting people by putting a burden on their shoulders that's worse than anyone could endure. He calls them a brood of vipers. He's always mad at the Pharisees. But sometimes he tells parables against them. And one of the famous Pharisee parables is in Luke chapter 18, where Jesus tells a story about a Pharisee who goes to church, goes to the temple on the Sabbath day. And the Pharisee stands up at the front of the room and says, "Thank God that I'm not a sinner, that I tithe, and that I do all things right. I fast twice a week. Thank you, God, that I'm so great. Thank you that I'm not like that guy at the back of the room." And he points to a tax collector. And a tax collector is a traitor. It's a Jewish person who takes money away from his own people to give it to Rome. And the Jewish people want to be free from Rome. So this guy's a traitor. And he's in the back of the room, and it says he beats his breast and says, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." And the Pharisee says, "I'm thankful I'm not that guy. I'm way better off than him." And Jesus says it's the guy at the back of the room, the tax collector, that leaves justified before God and not the Pharisee. And Jesus tells parables like that against the Pharisees a number of times. Eventually, that's exactly what would lead to the Pharisees planning to kill Jesus and plotting to have him arrested and handing him over to Rome so that he would be crucified. There are a couple of moments in the life of Jesus where the Pharisees have redemptive moments. In John chapter 3, we see Nicodemus, a Pharisee, come to Jesus at night. Nicodemus is a member of the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was like the supreme court of the nation of Israel of that day. About half of the Sanhedrin was Pharisees and half of them were Sadducees, another group. And Nicodemus, a Pharisee, comes to Jesus under cover of night because he doesn't want to be seen. But he goes to affirm Jesus and has a fascinating conversation in which Jesus says that everyone needs to be born again. And so when we talk about born again Christians today, it comes from that famous conversation with a Pharisee, Nicodemus. We'll see later on in the gospel that Nicodemus actually helped to bury Jesus' body. So though he was a Pharisee, he stayed faithful to Jesus in the end. We also see in Jesus' most famous parable in Luke 15, the parable of the prodigal son, we see a story of a father with two sons, one whom is faithful to the father and one who goes and wastes all the father's money. The one who is faithful, the older one, is resentful of the younger one. And the older brother represents a Pharisee in this story. And at the end, when the runaway son comes home, the father throws a party for the runaway son, and the older son, the Pharisee, is belligerent. He's mad that his younger brother came home and gets a party. But we see in the end that the father invites the older brother into the house to the party as well. His response is not to punish the Pharisee, not to scold him or chase him away, but instead to remind him that he's welcomed in as well. And so there are moments in the life of Jesus in which we see him embracing the Pharisees and trying to teach them the kingdom of heaven as well. In our modern day, there are still Pharisees in the churches. In fact, it's remarkable that Jesus spent so much of his time arguing with Pharisees, and yet his movement has gone on to create so many of them. Pharisees are religious legalists, and any time people cling to the law over a love for people, they've joined the Pharisees. Anytime they use the law to shame other people and scold them and put them down, they're joining the Pharisees in their methods. Anytime you see a group of people say, we want our church to stay separate from the world around us because the world is scary and it's corrupt and it will be a bad influence on our children. So the church is going to be our little circle of wagons, our little hideout where we're not influenced by the world anymore. That's the Pharisaical worldview. And it's ironic, given who Jesus was and how Jesus loved lost people and spent his time with outcasts and wasn't afraid to be branded as one of them, that so many people who follow Jesus today are completely Pharisaical in their beliefs and behaviors and think they're still being faithful to him. So that's a brief introduction to the Pharisees. I hope that's helpful. God bless you.